Hello, welcome to the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I'm Jeff Cranston. This week's episode is a little bittersweet for me. We're saying goodbye to Margaret Barondess, who is a manager in MDOT's Environmental Section Unit. She's been with the Department of Transportation for 33 years and was really a pioneer in helping to establish many of the policies and procedures at the state level to honor the National Environmental Protection Act, which was passed just a little more than 20 years before she took the job and really built up that part of the process at MDOT. She works with a lot of very talented and committed people, and I've enjoyed working with her and learned a lot from her over the years. And she talks about the balance that someone in her role has to strike, and this is both the federal U.S. DOT level and certainly at all state DOTs and at the local level too, at transportation agencies, between trying to honor the public's need for mobility, but also the need to protect the ecosystem and how important biodiversity is to our state. And obviously, the state of Michigan cares a great deal about the environment, especially when it comes to water, which is so important to us. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Margaret, thank you for making a repeat appearance on the podcast. Can you talk a little bit about we didn't talk before, I think, about your career trajectory and what brought you to this. I'm guessing in college, you didn't think you'd be in a role trying to educate people about the delicate balance between mobility and limiting the effects of road projects, mostly road projects, but all kinds of transportation projects on the environment. What got you to MDOT 33 years ago?
It's amazing what career trajectories people have, because I actually came to Michigan to go to graduate school to become a professor working in archaeology. And I finished my master's degree in 1990, and I thought, I don't want to be a professor. I just didn't care for the environment of the university setting. And you're young and you're trying to learn about what your likes are and dislikes. So my next move was to go to the State Historic Preservation Office and work there. And so I was a regulator for a few years before I came to MDOT. And I thought, well, this is sort of, I have people who are angry at me quite a bit. I'm not sure this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I got recruited to apply for a job at MDOT as the staff archaeologist. So lo and behold, I get the job and start in January of 1991, really having no idea what is ahead of me, and listening to my father, who said, "You're majoring in what? And what are you going to ever be employed?" And I remember thinking, walking in the door at MDOT, I have a job in archaeology. I am just beyond amazed that this is happening. And so then the really fun part for me was I got to participate in project teams on environmental impact studies at the time, because MDOT was studying, widening of I-94 in Detroit. We were studying freeways all over the place, new freeways. M6 was one of the freeways we started to study in the 90s too. And I was a member of all those teams. And I learned about the National Environmental Policy Act, working on those teams. And I loved the experience of planning projects, working with the public, thinking about how to balance environmental quality with transportation needs. And I really did fall in love with the industry. And one of the things I liked the most about my work was that you could see the results of what you had planned, and you could see your impact on the resources and what was happening with the resources when the project was completed. And you can say, I had a role in that. And I think the project's better, because I participated in a team approach. And so, it was sort of a natural move for me to start writing environmental impact statements. So I wrote the first Tier 1 and Tier 2 and the only Tier 1 and Tier 2 document environmental impact statement for MDOT for the M59 Boulevard near Howell. And a project which, by the way, has never been fully constructed. But that gave me even more experience with these teams, these team-based approach to developing projects. And so from there, I was able to do a couple things. I was able to build the environmental staff with some of the negotiations that we did as an agency with the regulators. We acquired positions for historians. We acquired positions for another archaeologist. So we built our team. And then in 2002, around that time, we had an early out. And some people may not know what those are, but it was an incentive for people to retire early. And it was a financial incentive for the retiree, but also for the state of Michigan. So you had a lot of people leaving at the same time. And we had a position, a section manager position open in environmental services. So I threw my hat in, didn't think I would get the job because there was a lot of competition. And again, they selected me to be the section manager, even though I had never supervised. So it was a whirlwind education in learning how to lead and learning how to supervise folks and learning how to influence the organization in ways that would help make our job easier in environmental. And we call that streamlining a lot of times. And that's where you can get everybody together to agree on a better way of doing business that is better for the environment, better for transportation. There are tons of opportunities for improvement out there in our government work. And I've always been big on grabbing at those opportunities and looking for chances for improvement. So that's been sort of a defining element of my career. And, I would have never pictured myself doing this work. When I was an elementary school teacher, who says I want to be doing this type of work when they're a little kid? And often it was hard to explain to my kids what I did. They would generally look at bridges and go, Mom works with bridges, kind of thing. It was easier for them to grasp. But, it's just been an amazing journey. I have had so many opportunities to work on exciting projects. Gordie Howe International Bridge, I was the project manager for the planning phase of that before Mohammed took it over. And then I was on the team for the environmental impact statement. US 131 S-curve project, which was an emergency replacement of the S-curve bridge in Grand Rapids. That was an incredible experience because we had to move the Grand Rapids Public Museum's storage facility to a new building. It was like moving your grandmother's attic on steroids to another building to build the S-curve. There's just been so many different experiences that I've been able to engage in, even the ones where we ended up with not having a project.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to freeze on the timeline. You indicated, when you came to the department and really kind of built that office. It's interesting to me that was just barely 20 years after Congress approved NEPA, and neither one of us want to be critical of what was going on at DOTs around the country at that time, but does that surprise you in retrospect that it took more than 2 decades to really put the tools in place to honor the act and what it's supposed to be?
I do think it's a continual evolution, and I feel like I've been part of history here with the industry and the way transportation has changed. When I started in 1991, the lead engineers, the supervising engineers that I worked with, had built the interstate system before NEPA. So you almost had to have a generational change before you could start opening yourself up to different ideas for transportation. Because what I encountered at that time was, I built the interstate system, before NEPA. What are you talking about? What are you asking me to do? And, I'm not familiar with this, even though NEPA had been around for a while. I think these were people who had developed their careers without that particular law in place. And so, quite frankly, for them, it looked like a barrier to progress or production, because MDOT, we are very good at producing projects. We're the best in the land at getting these projects done. So, that was sort of the work ethic. And the other thing that happened was we were very, very standards based at the time, with what we call the AASHTO Green Book, which was the Bible of how you design and build roadways. And I didn't know it at the time, but I came in as a historian and archaeologist, and I did a lot of negotiation that later on would be called context-sensitive solutions. Today, we call it complete streets, because we would be working in like a historic district, and I would say, if you make these changes, you're changing the land use pattern of this particular neighborhood, and that's not going to work for a historic area, for example. So how can we look at compromises, flexibilities? How can we look at data for the intersections? Where are the real safety concerns that are here? So, for me, it was like I was always fighting the Green Book in my early career. But then what happened is we finished the interstate system here in Michigan and nationally, and the industry needed to rethink, where am I going next? And Congress helped, of course. They passed laws that created the Transportation Enhancement Program, which allowed federal funding to be used for bike paths, for pedestrian improvements, for streetscapes, for historic preservation, for stormwater. So, that was a real change in the business. And then, we had opportunities then to experiment with different types of projects. And for me, the biggest change that's happened, I would say over the last 10 years or so, has been the focus on people as the users of your transportation systems. So again, I go back to a strength of MDOT's being asset management, early adopters, great leadership in that area, incredible expertise in asset management. Well, you're managing objects when you're managing assets. But we've been able to evolve to the point where, why am I managing those assets? It's for people to use them. So I need to think differently about how I'm managing those assets for those people, and learn more about how they're using those assets and what they are trying to do, where they're trying to go. And, maybe they need more opportunities to go from one mode, maybe from a vehicle to a bicycle or vice versa. And so I think MDOT's been through these incredible changes and has provided to me leadership on these topics that are related to greater needs that the society is putting forth with respect to transportation.
Stay with us. We'll have more on the other side of this important message.
The Michigan Department of Transportation reminds you to slow down, follow all signs, and pay attention when driving through work zones, because all employees deserve a safe place to work. Work zone safety. We're all in this together.
Well, you've talked before about this, and your work as a translator and navigator of environmental laws for the engineering staff. And I know early on you faced pushback, and you still do, and you still deal with this in public meetings and public events. One person's red tape is another person's environmental protection, but there are a lot of people that think that, all these rules and regulations, it's just the way the bureaucrats, thwart development. And how do you talk about that in a way that says, look, I'm not anti-development, but again, it's all about the balance.
That's a tricky question in the sense that it seems like, how could you have both? But I'm a firm believer that you can. And I'm also a firm believer in the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, decision-making process. It's a very intentional process that takes in information from the agency, MDOT, what are the transportation needs, what are my goals and objectives, takes in information from the public, and takes in information from subject matter experts, whether they're experts on wetlands or regulators on historic properties. It takes all of this information and it puts it together in a plan for implementing a project that is addressing what you've learned from all those different areas. And to me, yes, that's time consuming, but I always sort of say, let's front load that effort. Let's get that going. Don't be afraid to get out there and talk about ideas and talk about alternatives and have frank conversations about what's doable, what's not doable, because state agencies have a lot of constraints too, whether they're laws related to finance or laws related to who can do what. And the public may not know about that. So have a dialogue about what we can and can't do so you can reach sort of a point where a project is going to go forward, but there are measures that are in place that are going to make it better because of all of that input. So I feel like having a diverse set of eyes and opinions and perspectives, whether you're a neighbor, whether you're a commuter, with respect to a transportation facility, benefits all of us, the taxpayers, society, because we are getting closer to that balance of what are the needs, what should we be designing and building in order to try to accommodate those needs to our best abilities. So for me, it's about good decision making. You talked about, in fact, I wrote these words down. I'm glad you brought them up, but translator, mediator, facilitator, and I added another word, partner. And I think that MDOT has really learned how to be a good partner with cities, local jurisdictions, other state agencies like DNR, like Department of Ag, MEDC. I think that MDOT has reached a point where we understand that we can't solve all the problems that are out there, but through partnerships, we can do better as a state agency.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think in addition to those other state agencies you're talking about, this especially applies when it comes to the local communities. And this is why I know that there's always going to be frustration among community leaders and business owners, especially small business owners who, set up shop on a busy trunk line because it would be good for business. And they would hope that that road never has to be, rebuilt or maintained. And obviously it does. And they think blindly that, MDOT or maybe other agencies, road agencies, don't really care about their business, but they do. And I want to tell the critics, play the tape, because we have so many videos of these local leaders and business owners commending MDOT staff on the ground in those places for all the work they do to help mitigate the delays and the people being cut off during that construction. And I think that really applies, and that hasn't always been the mindset, but it's really become the norm in more recent years. So I think I just want to put a fine point on the partnership aspect. You have to understand so many things in your job. Like you said, you kind of started out with an interest in archaeology, and obviously history is part of it, but also everything from biology to botany and the protection of these species that a lot of people don't really think about or don't care about. And, we know what's happened with the protection of turtles over the years, but, most of us really like turtles. Not everybody likes snakes. So it's really important to the diversity of the ecosystem that we protect we treat them all equally, and give them the same protection. But how do you answer that when you run into people that say, or dating back to let's just say a certain politician demagogued the idea of building a fence to protect turtles on US 31 in between Muskegon and Grand Haven. Let's just say that. How do you talk to people about those things?
Well, I talk to people about, well, first of all, me personally, I lean on experts a lot. So, because I can't ever know everything about it, all the different things that we do in the environmental services area. And I listen to them very closely. So when we do protection for endangered species, we are not just doing that cavalierly. We understand what the goals are of the Fish and Wildlife Service in protecting endangered species, and that we also understand the ecology of it. Not me so much, but the experts do understand the ecology, that roads are part of the ecosystem. And so are snakes, and so are cute turtles and deer, and all the wildlife that are out there. Even protected plants like native milkweed plants, for example, are part of the ecosystem. And that you really have to look at the bigger picture sometimes and step back. Anytime someone can shoot down an idea at a specific location, say the turtle fence, for example, over in the Muskegon area, and say, well, that's just a dumb idea. But, that was done after a lot of thought and prioritization about where in the state do we have the biggest problem with turtles trying to cross the road. And that one just leapt out from the experts saying, we built the road through the floodplain for the river, and the turtles need to get from one side of the floodplain to the other side. They're going to go there because that's what their biology is telling them to do. So, we were the ones who came later and put this obstacle in the way. Now, if you take the bigger picture of, look, I took a look at this statewide, and this rose to the very top as being a serious issue, and I addressed it, it takes on a different context and a different tone, I think. So we base what we plan and implement in our section on sound science. We even participate in scientific research, like are snakes basking on our roadside, for example? Are they not? We work with other scientists to try to figure out the behavior of the animal, because we don't want to just do things for the sake of doing things. We want results. So, in order to get those results, you really have to, be part of the scientific community and understanding, is it performing well? Does this work well? Can we use this in other places where we have a similar problem? So, I think that, again, it's a matter of priorities. And yes, our wildlife is in trouble in a lot of places. Yes, we have to deal with resiliency and climate change, and protecting habitat and diversity is part of that picture too, because those tend to be areas that take water, that can hold water, that can help you with flood control and mitigation, that type of thing. So, trying to put those big pictures together in a way that makes sense to people and where they're coming from, I think is extremely helpful in my business.
Well, I think along with that, because you talked earlier about some of the things that you've dealt with in terms of big projects and mitigation, and obviously I think as you look at your career without identifying any single capstone, just establishing what you have for an environmental unit within the department, and the number of people that are passionate about it like you are and are committed to it. But let's talk a little bit about one, at least in my time, that I consider an incredible success when it comes to the biodiversity and the protection of species, but also, enhancing mobility through rebuilding a major freeway, one of the busiest in the state, in Monroe County, I-75, that basically sits at the same level as Lake Erie. So it presents all kinds of environmental challenges, but it was nationally recognized as a success. Can you talk about that one?
Yeah, that was a really exciting project we got the pleasure of working on. We received a grant from Federal Highway Administration through their ecological program to do a corridor conservation plan for I-75 in Monroe County up to 275. And our impetus for doing that was that we knew we had to reconstruct I-75. We knew that I-75 was in, as you mentioned, basically built on the floodplains for Lake Erie, the wetlands that surrounded Lake Erie that made it what it was historically, a tremendous resource biologically. We knew that on I-75 in the right-of-way, because of our mowing practices, we had dispersed lots of seeds over the years for endangered Sullivan's milkweed, which is a native milkweed. So we had a lot of that out there on the right-of-way, and probably other prairie plants too that were native to the area. So it was like a little island in a sea of farms and other types of development for some of this prairie style of biology that was taking place. So we got this money for this corridor conservation plan to sort of put together what are the environmental factors that we really need to focus on within the corridor when we go to reconstruct. Because reconstruct means you're digging everything up from fence line to fence line. So it's all going to get removed. So what are the issues that we should be dealing with, whether they're stream crossings, putting in new culverts that are bigger, that have different functions, that help with flooding, whether it's dealing with plants and transplanting them to Sterling State Park, which is one thing that we were able to do. And it was a very rewarding project too, because of the partnerships that we developed with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is an international flyway for migratory birds. And there are a lot of natural resources agencies like, well, the Nature Conservancy has a very large wetland restoration project called, I think it's called Erie Marsh. That they're working on there right on the lake shore near I-75. So we got to work with those partners to help us develop conservation practices for the right-of-way that would help promote these resources for the future. And also, this set the stage for environmental clearance for the construction projects. So we were able to streamline the environmental clearance process by using this corridor conservation plan and some of the action items that came out of that. So, again, that's the balance of trying to be sensitive to the natural environment and how you go about reconstructing your infrastructure and achieving goals that are positive for that natural resource environment.
Yeah, well said. As you look ahead, I guess, what would you tell, and I'm sure you've already had this discussion with your team and your successor, but what would you tell them to really feel good about what they do and keep the faith in what's going to continue to be a challenging environment, the push me, pull me between the development world and the environmental protection world, not to mention the underfunded transportation environment that we exist in here in Michigan. As we speak, it doesn't look like there's going to be a road funding deal wrapped up before the end of this session, and that discussion may or may not start anew again in the next one. But what do you say to those people?
I say to those people that, we've brought you here to make MDOT's projects better for clean air, clean water, neighborhoods, people. We've brought you here to add your expertise to the MDOT team. And you have positive contributions to make to the future of project development. So take advantage of that opportunity to educate and train our MDOT engineering partners on best practices, things you may have learned from other states, things you learned in school. And the best thing is that you actually get to work with people who are going to implement these practices. So you're here to support the transportation project development process and make it better.
Yeah, that's really nice. And it's nice that you can move on to your next whatever of feeling that way. I think about what you've done.
It's been a very rewarding career, Jeff. I'm a fortunate person.
Yeah, that's very, very good. Well, thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about what you do. I want to wish you luck going forward and say thank you again. I'd like to thank you once more for tuning in to Talking Michigan Transportation. You can find show notes and more on Apple Podcasts or Buzzsprout. I also want to acknowledge the talented people who help make this a reality each week, starting with Randy Debler, who skillfully edits the audio, Jesse Ball, who proofs the content, Courtney Bates, who posts the podcast to various platforms, and Jackie Salinas, who transcribes the audio to make it accessible to all.